Okay, so Bruchim Habayim to everyone. Zum dritten Mal. In the shiurim that I give, I generally like to deal with topics you could say that are from the arum of the yonim we're learning here in Kolel, or other topics that are of interest. So this time I would like to discuss a topic that we touched on in brief at the end of Siman Kuf Pigmol, which we are learning currently. The last piece in the Beis Yosef in the Siman is Kasav Arivash Shenishal Im Isser Nida Noyeg Gam B'Pnuya V'Heishiv Shedavar Pashatu Shenoyeg Ba V'Herich B'Davar. Beis Yosef quotes. This is all very much a short synopsis, courtesy of the Beis Yosef. Kasav Shatam Shlei Tiknu Tvil L'Pnuya Kadei Shlei Yavoyu De Michshel V'Estalek Imena Isser Nida HaChamor. So we have 2 points here. First of all, there's some kind of question for some reason as to whether Nida applies taka to Pnuya. And then there's a practical question as to, if yes, what about Tefillah? Should we arrange, should we allow for Tefillah or not? So these 2 questions are rather interesting, and they're also pretty relevant and practical today as well. Because, praktisch gerät, there are some people that are looking to chapen aveda, but they're not necessarily trampling all over Torah. They're not acting with impunity. It's bothering them. So sometimes that can take a person down a line of reasoning, trying to find justification within the bounds of Torah itself for what they want to do, to justify what they're doing. So when it comes to a Pnuya, it's not so clear, l'chayra, what is the Isser with a Pnuya? Is there an Isser Nida? Maybe it's not so chamor. And that's even without being an Isser Nida. There's a shaila of what exact gather of Isser Pnei is, and now B'Poyel they're Nidus as well. So if one would be able to argue and say that maybe the whole din Nida was never said b'chlal with regard to a Pnuya, it's only between a husband and his wife, so that would be great for someone like that. And even if you say there is a din Nida, so they would at least want to maybe arrange something. They want to go ahead with what they want to do, but at least let's be masad there that to avoid the Isser Karas, and then whatever the Isser Pnei is, whatever that they're already not so intimidated by. So this is a question that rears its head even in this generation, but it already showed up in the time of the Rivash, and from there the Beis Yosef is quoting it. And from there you also see it in the Ramah, in Siman Kuf Pei Gimel. The Ramah writes, B'kitzer ve'ein chiluk ben pnuya l'nesua l'inyan Isser Nida, Rivash, Beis Yosef, ki kol habal ha'nida chayev karet. So I would like to start by looking a bit in the Rivash, in the Makar, at greater length. We're not just going to take the bottom line. And they'll give us a bit more insight into this discussion, into the issues here. So it's in Shut Rivash, Siman Tav Chav Hey. The Rivash, of course, is a Bitzak Bar Sheshes. He lived in the 1300s, passed away in 1408, one of the big Chachamim in Spain at the time, the Talmud of the Ran. For those who were here last year, we already encountered him in the Tshuva regarding relating the Megillah in Spanish, that whole discussion. So his Tshuvas are very important, very influential. So the Tshuvas often begin by the address, who was written to. So it begins by saying Osca, which is the city of Huesca in Aragon in Spain, to someone by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Al-Tinsi, Al-Natansi. He was a Talmud Chacham who lived there. His other tshuvas with the Rivash. Interestingly, another tshuva with the Rivash involved that he used to look at his tzitzis when he said that Isa Moisai, and people used to laugh at him and say Isa Moisai is conceptual, not literally. And the Rivash said, no, it's your minhag, it's fine. Anyway, so he asked the following question of the Rivash. It's important because this is clearly the question is coming from a certain historical, societal perspective. So Rivash sums up with a question. He says, you asked me to explain to you, it says in the Torah, Isham Nidas Tamasli Sikr of the Galas Ervasa. Is this referring to every Isha Nida? It says, what Isha? Is it also a Pnuya? Or just is it being the Ish being the Pnuya? If that is the case, why was it never mentioned once in the whole Sefer Torah Habayis of the Rashba back then? That was one of the handbooks of these halachas. Never mentioned once. One through the Sefer doesn't say. Also, the Ravid, Sefer Bali HaNefesh, another Sefer, doesn't say it once. Go through it's always talking about husband, wife. Right, of course, as we know, all the halachas farm are always talking about under the assumption of a husband and wife. It didn't occur to them until the Rivash, it didn't occur to them to address this one way or the other. And another question here, another guy, the person asking says, "Visidach murgo b'fi kol adam da ploinis pnuya muteres." She's married, she's aser. She's pnuya, she's muteres. So it sounds like muteres. Maybe I don't know if we want to know why they used to speak that way, but the Rivash himself addresses it later. And then his next question is, the next kasha is, Chachamim zal, eich hinichu shum kedesha ba'olam. How did Chachamim allow the institution of kedeshus? They're not being matayr themselves. It's not a very frum occupation, so they're probably not makban on mikvah. Right? So sounds a little funny, but for him, I guess it was a stark kasha because historically we know that in Jewish communities up until fairly recently, there was a sort of unofficial, half-official status of kedeshus within the community. And there was some acknowledgement, some recognition of this reality to one extent or another. We actually mentioned it already once. We have a shiur once about Esnan Zoyna, accepting donations for a shul, and cases like that where that was the situation. So, ad kadekach, that the person, I don't know if he's talking means Chazal Mamish or he means Chachamenu in Spain, but he seems to be perceiving that there's a certain acknowledgement and allowance for the institution of Kedeshus. So the way he takes it is that we're not just ignoring, the crime happening in the edge of town. Who knows what's going on there? No, he understands there's some kind of communal recognition. And if Chachamim knew that there was the Isser Chomer of Nida, we wouldn't just let it go, at least without Tana. So from that question, brings us to the next question. If you're going to say that they are Chayev, then, right, so that's what he's asking. We should insist on, say the Tana of Eichle Tiknu Shum Tikun, Shum Geder, there should be awareness, community awareness, that anyone who's active should at least make sure to go to the mikvah, Isser Kares. Otherwise, it's a big nichshel, not just for the person, but all the people that are frequenting, it's all being nichshel and anish kares, and no one realizes what's going on. It's a big problem. So he's stumped. He can't understand, the shayl can't understand what's going on or how this works. That means there's no Isser. And if you're going to tell me, on the other hand, he almost convinced himself that it's talking out an Isser, but if the pasuk is only talking about Be'ishtoi, but the Rambam dafka in a lot of places, even though he doesn't say it clearly necessarily, but I guess, but the Rambam in a few places, it seems to imply taka, not just Ishtoi. So that's the question. So the Rivash answers, Dover Barer, that it's not Ishtoi Bovad, Bein Be'ishtoi, and now he has to find some rayas, even though it was never really discussed, head on. His first raya is in Krisis. It says in Krisis that it's possible with one bia to be over 6 avedas, 6 chatois. If the woman is somehow both his daughter and his sister and his brother's wife, also, somehow, it's also his uncle's wife, because if it's his daughter and his sister, so it's his So anyway, the final one is Venida. So at least in this case, it sounds like she's an Eishes Ish, we said, but she's not his Eishes Ish. I mentioned Nida on the list. Okay, so you already see that it's not just between husband and wife. He's Nichshel and someone else's wife, and there's also a Din Nida. Okay, that's the first raya. The second raya is in Ksubis. Oinus mefata, so it says Elo naris sheish len knas, right? By definition, oinus is with a pnuya, not someone who's married. And it goes through all the cases where you might think that's different. Mamzeres nesina kutzes giyeda shvuya achayse achayzav, etc., etc. And the last one is al hanida. There's a knas for an oinus by nida. No, so it's pretty clear that not limited to ishtoi or even to ishes ish. Third raya. Gemara Veda Zara says that based Dina Shel Chashmenai, we're geyser on a nachris that you're over Mishum Nida, right? Famous Rosh Tevis, Nashgaz. So the nun is Nida. even though really dama kedam behema, really it's b'chlal, there's nothing significant here, but that was the gzeira. Now, a person is only going to encounter an achris, not in a marriage situation, in a non-marriage situation. And if a Yisraelis was only asur mishum nida, if she's ishtoi, then why all of a sudden by goyim are we suddenly expanding it to everyone? Obviously, it's mirroring by Yidden, of course, it's by every single one. Now we want to expand it, not only single Jewish women, also single non-Jewish women. He says it's not for pashut. No one ever had this question before. I'm almost wasting my time to talk about it. It goes on. He says the pasuk says Valisha. The pasuk says Valisha b'nidas tumasa. Word isha. The way he takes it doesn't distinguish between what kind of woman. It doesn't say vel ishtacha. It says isha. Isha sounds a bit more like a married woman. So you look in Gemara, it's vidarshanet l'chayev al kol isha v'isha. He has multiple wives or whatever, which I don't know if that's a raya, but at least it's a taich. He's taiching it in that isha is teaching us other things. It's not being memayit p'noim. And now he wants to make the case that it's not just l'gabe be'ila, it's l'gabe all the dinim of arayas. In fact, that makes it worse than ishtei nida, right? So it says there's a sifra that even kreva to a nida, chibuk, v'nishuk is asur min ha'Torah. Even if there's no yichud, even if this doesn't really make sense that it's ever going to lead to going further, getting more serious, because there's no yichud here, but just the kreva itself is asur. What's the sifra? The drashas, leisikrav, leisikrav v'legales. The Rambam says it's taka min ha'Torah. The Ramban and the Asagas disagrees and says it's not malchus min ha'Torah, only b'bir gemura. The Bryce is just an asmachta. But either way, the yichud of a nida, b'pnuya, if she's the yichud of a pnuya, if she's a nida, is asur min ha'Torah, because she has the erva now of a nida. Because we know the yichud of arayas b'chlal is min ha'Torah, and nida is one of the arayas. So it was like that a pnuya nida is actually more chamer than ishtei nida, because ishtei nida, of course, is no issue yichud. You don't have to kick your wife out of your house, or to put a shomer between the rooms, except the chasen shaloi bal. That's a unique situation. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin where a min challenged Rav Kahana and said, "Oh, you hold that the nida is allowed to be misyachid with the man." But a pnuya nida, you treat it like any of the other arayas, and even a pnuya who's not a nida, just the isser pnuya is more chamer than ishtei nida, because even though there's no isser yichud pnuya min ha'Torah, but beis dinoi shel Dovid does roll after the ma'aseh of Amnon the Tamar. So there's no yichud by ishtei nida, but there's still at least the gzeiras isser yichud. Beis dinoi shel Dovid with a pnuya who's not a nida, and not just yichud. Even to look at a pnuya is asur, unless it's for purposes of marriage. Derech znus is asur. So, that's also more chamer than ishtei nida. You're allowed to look at ishtei nida, just not b'mkayim ha'Torah. So that's the Rivash's argument. He's trying to explain and put in perspective where these yisurim fit in. Your question about the Rashba and the Ravid, why didn't they mention in their Sfarim, they only mention ishtei nida? So first of all, I could tell you that they're dibru b'haiva, they're talking about the reality. And just like in Gemara Makkos, it happens to say, Ba'al chamesh nashav nidus behalamachas. Why does the Gemara say chamesh nashav? It should, the same din behalamachas, it could be not nashav. Fine, but you understand the Gemara is talking about the mitzvah, so you could say the same thing with the Rashba and the Ravid. But he says that's even a daichik. I'm even going to tell you that. The reason is that they're trying to teach everyone how to behave with their wives, b'tamasan and b'taharasan. It's a guide. It's a marriage guide. It's not a nida guide. It's a marriage guide. So anything that doesn't fit into the category of marriage, memela is not included b'chlal. And now he comes back to the isser of pnuya b'chlal. Says the isser of pnuya who's not in it, according to the Rambam, is min ha'Torah. And according to the Rambam, is even malchus, as long as hechina atzma lekach, that was her mindset. She wanted to libo derech znus. And according to the Rambam, she's included in the category of a Kedesha, even though she's not doing it professionally, she's not sitting in the Kuba Shal Zainis, she's not being mafker to everyone, but just even between two people, derech znus, called today casual. So according to the Rambam, that's mamish asur min haTorah, there's malchus. Of course, you also have the Metzias where it's without marriage, but not casual. It's a relationship. That's a separate discussion. He's also going to mention that in a bit. Even those who argue with the Rambam and say that there's no lav and malchus, but bias hapnuya, but still it's a drabanan because it's based in Dovid, they asked yichud. If they asked yichud, so obviously it goes without saying that the beer itself is obviously taken for granted that it's no good. It has to be the rabbanon. Some say it's actually an Isser Torah mitzad yaseh. It says ki yikach ish isho ba'ala. So if you want to have a relationship with a woman, the Torah says this is the mitzvah yaseh. If you skip the procedure, so you're mabatel mitzvah yaseh. That's another opinion. And then he says some takas say that if it's a long, ongoing relationship, that taka might be okay, and they say that is in fact the gather of a pilegesh, which is its own separate discussion we're not getting into. And the Rambam does not agree. He answers that for a hedjid. According to the Rambam, a hedjid kind of a pilegesh, only a melech, which is its own discussion. The Rosh already says about dvarim atikim. It's a well-known discussion. We're not getting into that here. But there's no one who says, no halachic opinion that says anyway that bias pnuya b'znos, even if she's not a nida, would be okay. You ask, why does everyone say pnuya muteres? First of all, she's mutaras through nisuin. So it could be they're saying, she's mutaras. You want to marry her, she's mutaras. Also, even beznus, seif kol seif, she's not an eishes ish. There's no zikas habal here. And in fact, in the get, it technically says in the get, harei at mutaras l'chol adam. So you see, that is the language we use to refer to a pnuya who's available potentially. But if you want to say that mutaras l'gam, even beznus, there's no issa d'rabbanan, that's a mistake. Weiter, we have this yichud. Yichud is also kol shekem the beer. And that's why the Dovid and the Rashba are focusing on ishtei nida, on marriage, because you did everything right. The only problem you have now is ishtei nida. But if everything else, there are many other problems, why should they even talk about it? There's no need to discuss it. The beer is also the rest. The yichud is also, the stakel is also. But of course, ultimately, even if I'm saying how chomer it is, how chomer pnuya is, ultimately, gadol oven ha'over k'shinida misheinin. I'm not saying that it doesn't make a difference. Seif kol seif, I'm telling you how bad pnuya is, but of course, nida is even more chomer, and he's still just talking about kreva, because it's a siyag of the gather to karas. You asked, how about the chachamim? Why are the chachamim allowing shum kadesha ba'olam? So he says, Chalila, who said Chachamim? He seems to understand it means Chazal, Taka. Chazal or Maniach Kadesha, or Materet, even if they table. The Pasuk says, let's see a Kadesha of Bnei Yisrael, the Ramban, right? So, certainly, until now we're talking about casually. You want to say Kadesha in the community with someone who's doing it professionally, even the Ramban says that the Pasuk is talking about someone who's Mafker, Atzma, in a professional, consistent way, a kubishal zaynus. So everyone agrees that no one would ever allow that. Elamai, we live in a generation where Gedolei Adar are ignoring the problem because they're concerned that if we ban this, then they'll just do worse. There'll be nichshel ben nachriyos, and it's going to be even worse. So the Kadeshis b'mei Chazal were in upper Tzin Chachamim, Adrabah, it was a Gzeira and a Shmad. You see, it says in Avodah Zarah, Chanina ben Trajin, that the Regezer al Bita Elisha b'Kubishal Zaynus was a horrible story. You're saying, why do they even think that that's worse? You say, Nashgaz, the word is that we do treat Nachrias as worse.
But as compared to the Eisers Karas.
It's the Geser Karas, basically, but for whatever the reasons are, he says, Teitzi Eish, Matzah Kaitzim, it could be just leads to intermarriage, it could be other issues as to why you want to avoid crossing the line into Nachrias. He says, and he says, by the way, though, if you look in that Ma'aser and Avodah Zarah, it seems like the Kadeshis, even then, we're talking Nizar not to be Meshamash Remeni Dyson, because the whole story there in Avodah Zarah, it's a very sad story, that Beruria Eishus Rameir, she told him, I feel very uncomfortable that my sister is trapped in this situation. There was no legal way to free her, but Rameir took money, and he said, if I see that she wasn't ever in Isser, and that's will happen. If she ever in Isser, never mind. So he dressed up like a horseman, he came to her, and he asked for, hashmi'ini, and she said, derech noshimli. That was her excuse. She said, okay, I'll wait. She said, no, there's other people. It's better. What do you want from me? So he realized that she says this to everybody. So she's avoiding. So what do we see from this story? And then he went into the nest, all of that. So we see from the way the Rosh is learning is we see from here that it seems like she said it to everybody and everybody accepted it. Based on what? Based on Torah. So that it was normal, even for those who were forced into it, that if they said, I'm following Torah, that people said, okay, otherwise the excuse wouldn't work. Now he gets to the second point. What about the Tevilah? There's nothing to ask over here because since the Pnuyas are Surah, as we said, so if she toivels, it's a mikshel, be makel in the Isser.
So it's not better for a woman. Let's say a woman that does want to do once.
Yeah.
It's not better for it to be table.
So we're getting to this point. This is the famous point that is relevant till today in the debate today, where he says that you see that it's going to lead to a greater mikshel, which is what you saw then, you see now. Brings the Maisa from the Talmud Chacham, who was Mekel b'mei Buna. We don't have time to get into all of that. So Elamai Amal, they used to be Nizar and Taris, right? You see, of course, in the discussion that Amal and the Gemara, they're talking Sai about the Taris and Sai about the Baila. So that's why I'm at Bilin Sektanis, for those reasons. Also, there might have to be a vert of Tefillah B'zman Mitzvah, even for Pnuya Nida. But the Ramban wrote, but Lua B'deiris Achreinim, nothing to do with wanting to do this for any particular reason and aim. That's Zach. Maybe every girl should go to the mikvah every time because Tefillah B'zman. So the Ramban already said that Chumra Da'asila De'kula, like based on that story of the Talmud. So here we see this idea, the Rivash introduces this idea that we don't want to get rid of an Avera Chamura if it just encourages an Avera Kala. Maybe it's better to leave the Avera Chamura. He says, I went there at length, I probably shouldn't have, didn't need to, but you asked, so I answered. On this Nakuda, there's a famous marker also from that to Kufa in the Sefer HaAkedah, the Akedah Yitzchak on Parshias from Yitzchak Ramah, Parshas Vayera Shar Chav. So he's discussing there the union of Sdoim and the parallels to the Pelegish Begiva, because there's a lot of parallels, how they treated guests, how they treated the women. And he's trying to figure out what's the difference between the two stories. Why did Hashem respond to Sdoim like this and to Pelegish Begiva like that? So the Akedah says that this tells you the answer. That even though they behave more or less the same, but in Sdoim, they made a shita out of it. That was the law. They were following the law when they did it. He says that's worse in a certain way. What's the issue over here? The issue here is Fakart. They never said you're allowed to do it. They had good laws, but no one's following the laws. So that's why Hashem didn't punish them like that, like Sdoim. But the problem here is that the judges, the Sheftei, the Shevet, they were responsible to get rid of this problem. They saw, they weren't Meicha, they ignored, it was before Hasyas, and now all the Shvatim are Chayiv. So that's the story, that's the spiritual context for the story of Pelegish Begiva. He says, V'cheinu adin, anytime the Yechidim in the Tzibur are Nichshel, Yayin Nesach, he's referring already to more contemporary things, Yayin Nesach, Gvina Shaldoyim, Shatnez, that by ignoring it, you're enabling it. So then you become responsible, and it's everyone's achrayis. He says, this is the famous quote, I struggle with this. The Nashim HaKadeshus, that the Sheftei Yisrael Asher B'Deireinu, they weren't sure whether they should prohibit it or not. And in fact, in some Kehillas, they already litin lahem chanina. They like pardoned them. They gave them an acknowledgement. They said, "Okay, we recognize you as what you're doing." And in some cases, they even got a pras mehakol. They even got a stipend, a communal stipend. There was the community institution of Kadeshus. Why? Because they felt that the community needs it. It's going to save them from getting into greater trouble. Ish, goyas. So better this. As I argue, the Akedah says, I argued many times with Fneim, and I explained to them that it becomes our achrayas. We're responsible, not just they're doing whatever they're doing. We become responsible as a group, just like the Pelegish Begiva, etc. We also have the Chuvas of Yehuda ben Rosh. His nephew asked him, the same question in Spain. They had this question. We have noshim lufkaris, so some say we should get rid of them. They see a kadesha, they don't taivel, nida, and some say better this. Vayis arvu zera kodesh b'vneis necher, sakanas nefashis. Not just that, it could even be sakanas nefashis. You're starting up with the other people. Who's right? So he wrote back, "Ein halachic yesh oimrim," that said that it's fine because it's a lav and a karas, and better they should get in physical danger by wandering off into dangerous areas than to be misaken in nefashis. Nowadays, it's a tshuva and shuvas van hagas of a Moshe Sternbuch. He says you have a person who's living biznus imisha. The person, he says, the situation is the person couldn't divorce his wife. She's misareves, so he's living with someone else. It's a taikfa, but they don't want to be over on nida, so she's going to be toivel. And now the question is, should we stop them? I don't know where this question is being asked from. It makes a big difference if it's Eretz Yisrael or somewhere out of town. So he says, I know a story. He says, Lady Rabbi, Rav Moshe Schneider, who we knew from London, when he was there, he says, he told me that there was a city in Lita where they started being lifritz, Rahman al-Islam biznus. So the Rav, this is already probably in the last 150 years when society was starting to collapse in different ways. So the Rav said, they should talk to be toivel. And what they saw b'muchesh that the hechsher of the mikvah just made the whole situation worse. And it was, pashsa magefa does nuspeir. And then he quotes the Rivash. So if they're asking, you don't have to mix in. You don't have to involve yourself. If she's going on her own, you don't have to tell her maybe not to and to force her to be over in Isra. But depends. If it's Migdar Milsa, then maybe Taka should stop them. And this is Taka, a big controversy. I'm sorry, give me another minute or two. There's a big controversy in Eretz Yisrael where the Rabbanut, etc., has a certain control over the religious functions with the backing of the government. And the nuns, this became a big controversy. There were letters put up by the Rabbanut, by Rabbi Yosef, Shmuel Vazner, and others that said we don't allow Ravakot, Almanot, Grushot to use the local mikveh. Of course, you have more liberal Rabbanim in Israel who disagree. And this is one of the religious wars, culture wars going on there. Here in America, I assume that it depends on the community. If it's a very frum community, I'm sure they wouldn't let it fly. If it's a more liberal community, then maybe they don't ask questions. Huh? Good question. Ask her off. And this question isn't only negaya to these inyanim. In Yapia Emer Chelek Vav Yeredesim and Gimel, he talks about this as a general question. He quotes some Yehuda Yala Assad about the Chalutza L'Koyen. They're threatening that they're going to shmadzich if you don't let them marry. So maybe we start saying, Kehanim is Manazer, not really Kehanim, they don't have Ksav Yichos. Sometimes we use that as a factor in a heter. Chas v'shalom, we're not crossing the line here and playing around with Kehanim. You want to shmadzich? What's your problem? Priya Sada, L'Gabe Minekas, 21 months. Can we, if the alternative is they're just going to go ahead without Chuppah V'Kiddushin, maybe we should. I just heard an example like this here in the community. It sounds like already today you'll get a Tatum, maybe to talk, not wait the amount of time you have to wait. But these are the questions. To wait the amount of time between marriages before you allow the woman to remarry, even if they're living ba'avera. Okay. Yeah, Menakas. He quotes himself, and he was asked about a hotel that they give you a glass of milk after your meal, whether it's fleishiks or not. You ask for a glass of milk, they give it to you. So should we take the hechsher away? Or, it's your... So these are the types of questions, and, it depends how chomer the Isser chomer is and how chomer the Isser kal is. Here in Piskei Be'er Moshe, Moshe Shten and the David Sinner, he has a list here. He says of things that we're never allowed to be mevater on. Those who want to table by day and not by night, even though there's what to discuss. Those who want to table bechatzitza v'miyat hamakpid. Those who want to table with long nails, etc., things like that. He said these are things you're never allowed to back down on, even though who knows they might not go at all. Now there's one mucker, and this will be, I'll have to stop here. There's one mucker though. The Teres Hashlamim, of course, it can never be so simple. The Teres Hashlamim is the one mucker that maybe kind of somewhat suggests that maybe it doesn't apply to Pneuya. That's when everyone gets very excited. If you look in the Placey in Simukov Begimel, he says, of course, Ben Pneuya and Suak, the Ramah says, and no one ever has such a question, But the guy in Minchas Yaakov in the Torah Sashlamim, Yotza Chutz L'Gidre Geder Chachamim, and he made a mixture, as he threw in this line that says, the Gemara Nidda, that why is Nidda 7 days? Vishum Shloit the Sgan al Bailo. You have these drashas and Gemara as to the time of Nidda. So you see from the Gemara that has to do with the relationship of the husband and the wife. So maybe not by a Panuya, or at least not the Gzeira of Tumas Shiva. And the place he screams at him, and okay, we don't have time to get all into it. Chida also, and you don't bring rayas from drashas. Today also, Rabbi Menashe Klein and Shut Mishnah Halachas has a halachic, seemingly that people don't know. There's a misconception that it's talking on this, and again, he goes into tremendous halachics to convince everyone that it's talking on this, and we'll leave it at that.